All right. Well, welcome everybody to the October 25th meeting of the Kubernetes Service Catalog SIG. This is a special meeting to continue discussion from yesterday in advance of our face-to-face in Boulder next week. So today I would like to focus on single use case and really even arguably just a single facet of a use case and talk exclusively about what does it mean qualitatively. Let's forego any implementation specifics, and maybe we'll get there if we can come to a qualitative agreement. What does it look like to you when you consume a service? So I'm going to volunteer to take notes today. So let me share my screen. All right. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see my browser window? All right. I'm not hearing any no's. So I imagine at least one of you has an idea about what does it look like to consume a service. I want to mostly listen because I have my own opinions about this and I don't want to put my thumb on the scale. So completely at random, Doug, what does it look like to you when you consume a service?
To consume a service. So I can't help but think of it in terms of Cloud Foundry, meaning an application gets the credentials of how to talk to a service. That to me is what it means to consume it, to get the credentials.
Okay.
And Doug, in your world, do you envision credentials being different from the endpoint that it's connecting to? Or how does, like in the credential world, in the Cloud Foundry, it has the endpoint baked into it, right? I think it's basically host, port, user, and password. Is that what you're thinking here?
It's all the same thing to me. Credentials, coordinates, all the information you need to talk to some endpoint that represents the service.
Okay, good. Just want to be very clear.
Yep.
Okay. Does anybody have anything they want to add to that?
One question I have, because you mentioned VCAP services, it feels like VCAP services is subtly different in that may contain multiple bindings to multiple services. And is that material?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. Just to call it out to folks that may not be familiar with the Cloud Foundry model. In the Cloud Foundry model, you have a service instance, and you can bind your application to that service instance. And what happens when you do that is that there is an environment variable that is populated in your application called VCAP services. And I think, Doug, you told me VCAP stands for VMware C something application platform. Is that?
Something like that. I can't remember either. But yeah, something like that.
Okay. So there's a thing. There's an environment.
Cloud application.
Sorry, what was that?
Cloud application.
Cloud application, yeah. Okay, so there's an environment variable called VCAP services that gets its value is like a JSON representation of both the endpoint that you need to talk to work with a service and the credentials and like username, password, if there's some kind of API key. They all go into this JSON struct, which is the value of this VCAP services environment variable. And
it's keyed up by service name, right? Service, it is a map.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Jason, sometimes you write your name as JSON. So Jason Hansen's point was that the VCAP services content is subtly different than the Kubernetes model because, Jason, do you want to elaborate on that? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, I think the thing that's interesting, at least from my perspective, is that if you are bound to multiple instances of the service or bound to a service multiple times, VCAP services is a little bit challenging in the way that it would express that. And I think that was one of the things at least we previously discussed as wanting to support. So I am an application I need 4 MySQL databases, and I want to call, bind 4 times and get different service instances each time for a sharding use case, for example.
So one thing that I'm hearing in that I'll pose for discussion is, do we want to support VCAP services? Is that a goal that we have? To make it so that an application moving from Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes would be able to not change the parsing of VCAP services? Is that something we want to do?
Until we hit a roadblock that says we can't do it, I'd kind of like that to be one of our goals if possible, just to make it easier for the client to migrate applications from Cloud Foundry to Kubernetes.
Now, when we say supporting that as a goal, I think it's important that we support that as a goal in addition to whatever the native consumption mechanism is, right? I think it's important that new software being written against this system is using the new magical ways like config maps and secrets or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, I mean, even
I think the 2 use cases are, yes, let's support backwards compatibility, but yes, let's also think of how we envision Kubernetes applications consuming services in the current world, and let's make sure we support that as the primary use case.
Well, I assume that there would be more than
quick,
one way to
who
do
is
it.
speaking then, so I can get the name right in the notes?
Sorry, this is Brendan.
Oh, okay. Now that you say that, Brendan, I do recognize your voice.
Thanks.
Yeah, I assume there would be probably more than one way you can get to the credentials and that kind of stuff. But I did want to make sure VCAP services was one of the ways, yes.
yeah, I think that's a good topic for future discussion about how we actually enable that. For sure, if applications are not, if clients are not familiar with VCAP services today, and then the way you would do this without the service broker mechanism is you would just create a secret and or config map and use the downward API to plumb that in whatever form the client application expected, whether that be environment variables, command line, or file. So I imagine for legacy applications, we'll need to support those existing mechanisms, although it require more work by the user by hand.
So, Brian, would it be fair to say that you would prioritize the native Kubernetes concepts over VCAP services?
Well, I think fundamentally, the credentials will get and should get captured using native Kubernetes mechanisms, and there's still a lot of flexibility on how you represent things even within those. Like both secret and config map are just arbitrary key value maps, right? So there could be a variable named VCAP services in your secret, although that would be pretty weird because it would contain the service discovery information as well, which normally we would put in a service. So I think I don't know if it makes sense for there to be one standard for all applications versus, different existing conventions for different applications. Mm-hmm. Certainly eventually, like if we look at how this works inside Google, there's one uniform way of doing it, and then that really makes it easy to consume arbitrary services from any other application. Because you don't have to figure out what is the funky mechanism that's used for any particular application. You get identity for free, and then you just have to configure authorization on the server side.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it, this is Martin, sort of keying off of one of the things that Brian said in his group post today was about having some sort of mapping potentially. We've sort of talked about that in the Cloud Foundry working group as well, is when you create the binding that maybe you can provide some mapping of how the values get mapped into your environment. And I could imagine that doing it in a VCAP services compatible way would be maybe an option you could put in there so that it was something you could explicitly say, hey, expose these because the client is expecting them in VCAP services versus just being little more raw.
Yeah, this is Kurt. Yeah. I think can it not be some kind of like adapter layer? Because I would think that there'd be more, proprietary connection mechanisms.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. It'd be using that adapter layer, but it could be a different adapter layer, I guess, if we couldn't do it using the mapping thing.
Yeah, so there are some primitives that we can use for that. For example, as Brian mentioned, there's the downward API that allows you to inject the value of secret config map and keys like the pod's IP address and the name and namespace of a pod into environment variables. There's also a variable substitution feature that allows you to compose environment variables, the values of other environment variables. I'm not sure that you could get all the way to what VCAP services is. I think you could probably get pretty close, but it might be a bit of doing with the current feature set. So I think the synthesis, though, that I'm hearing from the group is that we think that, one, we should expose this information using the native Kubernetes concepts, and that we should make it possible for you to transform or adapt the values into what your application expects to see, which is a goal that we have had when developing the downward API and the variable substitution syntaxes. Does anybody disagree that that's the general character of the group right now?
So yeah, there's a long discussion about this topic on issue 3716. I just posted that into the chat in the main Kubernetes repo. A lot of applications, unfortunately, have very inconvenient configuration file formats. So the downward API is not sophisticated enough to do the things that a lot of these applications need. So discussing sidecar approaches and things like that. Sort of arbitrarily complex transformations for configuration files and arbitrary formats.
Mm-hmm. Would we be happy to sort of take a half measure and say that the credentials thing can be an opaque key value thingy and let the service consumer and the service producer pass it through kind of like Cloud Foundry does and call that good enough for V1 rather than trying to tackle the typing and templating situation here?
Yes.
One of the pieces of information I would like to see is some kind of reference to documentation about the service. So if there is a Swagger doc or something about the service you are consuming, and maybe that's available within that service, but having a reference to it from the catalog, I think it would be captured at this moment.
Sorry, who's speaking?
This is Kurt. So like a link, a reference to a service description document.
Yeah, so I actually think that is, there are some facilities to accommodate for that in the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API. I would need to go back and look more closely at that. So now that I think everybody who wants to speak has spoken on this, I will add a thought that hasn't been mentioned yet. And I think that part of consuming a service is that you have network connectivity to that service. I'm not sure if that has to be necessarily part of V1, like perhaps for V1 we can assume that you have connectivity. But one of the things happening now in the networking space in Kubernetes is establishing an API for network policy that controls ingress, currently controls ingress from between pods in a namespace, like which pods can send traffic to other pods in the namespace, and then also which namespaces can send traffic to another namespace. So I'll just throw that out there. With the additional information that in the future, I think egress is going to be incorporated into network policy. And just a tiny piece of context, one of the use cases for that is there are cluster operators that want to manage the connectivity of pods to the outside world and connectivity of pods to other pods and namespaces, other namespaces. So I do think that in the long term, probably the notion of consuming a service has to include network connectivity into and out of that service.
So would you say that's sort of like a provisioning step?
I think provisioning is kind of an overloaded term, so I'll answer that question more generally and say that I see that it might be part of the catalog's responsibility for creating resources that are beyond a single, just beyond a service secret config map. So like one thing that I could see happening in the future is that the catalog or a controller could be responsible for creating a network policy object in the consumer's namespace that made it possible for pods that are running in that namespace that match a certain label selector to connect to the service or connect to the endpoint presented for a Kubernetes service for a service catalog service. But that's a little prescriptive and in violation of the terms that I set down, where we're not going to talk about those implementation specifics yet. So forget I said that. And maybe we can find a way to strike it from the recording. Or I'll use my Men in Black.
No, I do actually kind of like this, because I think this is part of that the conversation about consumption and sort of kind of what is available. So at least making sure that we think about what the network connectivity means, I think is a very important part of it.
Yeah, and so already it's the case that we take this into account when deploying service on Kubernetes. For example, if you create a service of type load balancer, Kubernetes can make sure that firewalls are open for you and things like that. Expose your service. So, I think it does make sense to be somewhere part of this. I don't know if it's part of the service, which part of the mechanism makes the most sense, but there would be some part on the server side, like with the existing service resource, and some part on the consumer side. So I think definitely the consumer side would make sense in this context.
Okay. So I'm going to take a stab at trying to synthesize all this stuff into a single statement. So I think fundamentally, the information required to use a service should be present in the Kubernetes native concepts. It should be realized in the Kubernetes native concepts. It should be possible to adapt those resources into a format that an application can consume. There is some threshold between, or on one end of the spectrum, Kubernetes should provide mechanisms to do this. On the other end of the spectrum, for arbitrarily complex use cases, there can be mechanisms like sidecar containers that shift the burden of the transformation away from Kubernetes and into user containers. Is that accurate, everybody?
I think that sounds right. I just don't know how the sidecar container. This is just because I don't know enough about. But if I have a sidecar container, I don't know how it can muck with the other containers, like environmental variables or stuff like that.
Yeah, so just briefly, one option for doing that is you can have an init container that runs and prepares an environment file in a volume that an application sources when it starts. That would be very high level one way to do it.
But then the app would have to. We can take this offline.
Yeah, we can take it offline. Okay.
Yep.
Let's see. So we have about 20 minutes remaining. Let me take the temperature of the group. Do we think as a group it is better to continue at this very high level and talk about another use case? Or is it more advantageous to talk about what does this look like in terms of in terms of the native Kubernetes resources? Let's forget about the mechanics of how and say that you've made a binding or a claim on a service, specifically what happens in your namespace after that. I think we could go either way. And I have no opinion that I'm willing to share right now. Maybe folks can comment in the chat or speak up.
So I mean, sorry, I just want to make sure that this doesn't get lost. But the synthesis of the above doesn't mention anything about the network connectivity part, I don't think.
Okay, good point. So
I guess there should be something else that, whether it's part of this or that, but something should ensure that the right knobs and sliders get turned and slid so that the connections happen.
It's almost like the reasonable expectation of the consumer is that once you get in credentials that you can connect to the thing that you just got credentials for.
Okay, I put a sentence in there that reads, consuming a service means that you get the Kubernetes primitives containing coordinates, credentials, and configuration, and that you have network connectivity where it is needed. Does that encompass everything?
Yeah, so as I said in the email thread, I don't think we need to conflate everything together or have everything to have a useful solution. Like one part is actually getting credentials that you can access somehow. That would be, for example, creating a secret in your namespace could satisfy that. But there could still be some manual work to consume that into your container by modifying your pod spec, for instance, or writing an init container or something like that. I think that would be a good initial step that would be useful even if we didn't have auto magic for doing that. Especially given I have no idea how many applications I'll actually be able to consume any particular format we choose, but even VCAP services, like out of the box.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and I can second that. So for context, I have actually personally worked on secrets, config map, downward API a fair amount, and the overriding like design intention has been to provide like an 80% solution that allows you to go the remaining 20% yourself if you're not satisfied with the first 80. So I'll second Brian's opinion there that like I think at V1 if we could get to the point where you get a secret and you get maybe a service and maybe a config map, that will be an awesome first 80%. And there are ways that you'll be able to go the extra 20 yourself, if that doesn't get you where you want. But I welcome dissenting opinions.
I'm totally on board for the handoff being a secret or a config map. Totally great. So with Stuart works well.
So on that point, though, I'd like to dig a little deeper on the Kubernetes way of doing things. And forgive me, because a lot of my background is because I come from Cloud Foundry and Docker, and I'm trying to get my head around the scope of things. In my mind, I keep equating namespaces in Kubernetes to sort of like spaces in Cloud Foundry. Right? It's just a space where people can upload applications to, and it's like maybe a departmental staging area, for example, is one particular space. Mm-hmm. And in Kubernetes, I get the sense that a namespace is something similar, where it's not meant to be used for just a single application. It's meant to be a place where you can group applications by whatever means, or whatever grouping mechanism means something to you, right? And I get the sense then that secrets are the mechanism by which sensitive information is shared, and secrets are namespace scoped. So that then implies that secrets are in essence visible to all applications within a namespace. Now that's somewhat different than something inside Cloud Foundry, where each application, even if they're in the same space, doesn't necessarily see the secrets, or in this particular case, the credentials, that other applications are using to talk to various services. So there's a little bit of, I don't know what you want to call it, security, but there's a little bit of separation there. And I'm trying to wrap my head around whether it matters.
Is the separation that you're discussing implemented via VCAP services population for apps? And so like within a space, you may have multiple apps, and each app is responsible, someone is responsible for binding each app to a service that it has to use, and they get injected with VCAP services based on those bindings, so that amongst the applications in a single space, you might have varying degrees of overlap with the credentials that each app can see relative to its peers in the same space. Is that right?
Yeah, basically each application can have its own VCAP services because each one is bound to a different service. So each application only sees the credentials for the services that it talks to, which is, I think, somewhat different than the path we're heading down with Kubernetes, where any app can basically grab the credentials from any other app as long as they're on the same namespace.
Yeah,
that's accurate. Sorry,
No,
I think Brian was starting to talk.
Yeah, I was going to disagree with you. No, it's not. So I guess there are a couple of things. We don't have a lot of suggestions about best practices, but just to give an example that Paul is familiar with, namespaces are used to build OpenShift projects on. So, and we originally discussed that this might be similar to, say, projects in GC or something like that. So you can think of it as a scope for maybe a single team. I wouldn't say it's a scope for like a whole department, probably. I wouldn't recommend that. Maybe a cluster would be a scope for a whole department. I mean, it all depends on a bunch of trade-offs. It depends on how big your clusters actually are. Depends on how your operations teams work. Depends on what kind of separation you want between dev, staging, and prod, and all kinds of things. But I would like to see namespaces used potentially as fine-grained as for individual applications. Like I would like to deploy a Helm chart into its own namespace and facilitate communication across namespaces, because namespaces provide a really convenient scoping mechanism for uniquifying names, for scoping label selectors, for providing fine-grained authorization using something like role-based access control. So, we don't have a lot of patterns. Some people are using it that way, and there have been a couple of blog posts about uses of namespaces. Some people use them for separating dev, staging, and prod. Other people use clusters for that. So I think there's a pretty broad range of ways to use namespaces. Now, we do have mechanisms that help people subdivide namespaces. Label selectors are a common thing. a common way, although that requires agreement effectively among everybody playing in the same namespace as to how to apply labels to their resources so they don't get overlapping label selectors unintentionally. And we talked about mechanisms that would potentially enforce some rules about labels being applied to objects, but we don't have that yet.
Yeah, there's also service accounts.
Right. Yeah, I was getting to that. So you can actually create a service account, there's a default service account, but you can create additional service accounts. And for individual pods, you can specify which service account you want to use. And the service account can be used to restrict what secrets can be accessed by those pods. So you can actually put a list of secrets on a service account and say these pods can only access these secrets. And that provides sort of defense in depth a little bit against pods grabbing secrets from someone else. It's also sort of incumbent on the user to set up whatever authorization rules, say RBAC rules, for allowing which users and service accounts can access which resources within a namespace. I was actually just about to start a thread on SIG auth about making it easier to do per object access control. You can express that with RBAC today, but it's really cumbersome. And I think that's a use case that we might want to facilitate better.
So it sounds like we can do all of everything here. And if it almost seems like a cop-out to go and say it's a service and user has to do everything to go ahead and have a setup that sort of kind of works. I mean, that's what I'm really being a little bit facetious here, but we are basically saying we'll slap a secret namespace and it's up to the user of the cluster then to go ahead and know all the right things to make sure that the right things happen.
I'm not saying it has to be up to the user. I'm saying that the user could do things manually or we could do things automatically, but these things are possible to do.
Right. I guess what I'm saying is I would argue that we should be targeting that 80% case, not just being a secret, and everything else is left as an exercise for the reader. But that's just my opinion.
So Brian, do I have it correct that you think namespaces are a good starting border of encapsulation to work around for the catalog? With the implication that we can get into finer grained mechanisms like service accounts and label selectors at a later time?
That's my opinion.
Okay, so just want to make sure I had that right in the document.
Like 10 different teams share the same namespace. They're going to run into a lot of other problems if they do that.
Yeah, so just some extra context on that, Doug. Like I have seen namespaces of all different sizes. I've seen namespaces that have a single app. I've seen namespaces that teams share, and I think like part of the promise and power of Kubernetes is that it allows cluster operators to have some discretion in how they provision namespaces and what dividing lines they use. I tend to agree with Brian's sentiment that initially namespaces are probably a good granularity to look at divisions among, and we can definitely add things like service account scoping of secret visibility at a later time, but it's probably useful for the initial discussion to focus on namespaces.
Okay. I was actually very glad that you guys mentioned the idea of one app per namespace, because even though I don't particularly like that as an approach, I'm glad that it's not completely insane to think of it that way if you did want that level of security. As for the rest of it, I need to go back and think more about it, but I have a feeling you guys are probably right that namespace is probably the right scope for this stuff. It's just a different mindset for me, so I need to go back and think about it and make sure that it's not going to break any of the use cases we have.
I've never found it profitable to bet against Brian Grant being right.
Probably true, yes.
All right. Let's see.
I have one question then, sort of that's related to this. If at some point there will be some kind of like UI to browse the catalog, which things will you see in the catalog? It will probably then have to span namespaces.
That's a good question. I might ask that we table that for a follow-on discussion either tomorrow or Thursday. But just so everybody heard it, the question is, when there is a UI for the catalog, as a particular user, what services do you have the ability to see? We do have, we've been calling that concept curation so far, and we do have use cases that we have that I put into a GitHub issue that I created around it. So that is not a question unique to you. I wonder though if it might be, actually we have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can table that for now and see.
I have a clarifying question about that.
Sure.
Do you mean catalog of service instances you can bind to, or catalog of service classes you can instantiate, or both?
A catalog of services that I can consume. And I initially was thinking that would be all the services in your namespace, like by default, and everything else would be an external service. But if we only have one, if it's possible to only have one service per namespace, the catalog isn't much use.
So it sounds like there are perhaps some assumptions that it might be good to just talk through really quick. I don't think there would be any kind of limitation a priori absent quota or some other counting mechanism for how many services you can consume. And by that, I mean, you may have quota on those, but in a vacuum, I don't think there should be any limit. I think perhaps there may have been some confusion about the deployment of applications into namespaces and how deep or wide is a namespace. And what we've been talking about is as a initial assumption, make the assumption that there's really fundamentally only a single application in a namespace so that we can defer discussion of things about further subdividing namespaces like service accounts, label selectors, RBAC, et cetera, until a later date. Does that clarify things at all?
I mean, especially if we're focused on the black box case mainly initially, you would expect the black box service to be somewhere else, not in your namespace. So, if you run your stateless front end, then it's consuming a database or something like that. I would expect that to be a common case.
Yep, agree. So we have about 3 minutes left. I think this has been a really good discussion. I think this clarifies things a little bit further. I wonder if we have a volunteer who will put their hand up to write this up into a use case and submit a pull request to the incubator repo to capture this concept. And I'm happy to do that work if nobody else has time or availability to do it.
I'm happy to help collaborate on that if you want.
Okay. Well, do you want to take the token, so to speak, or take the baton on that one, Jason? And we can put our heads together when you make a pull request or before?
Yep, sounds good.
Awesome. Okay. Anything else in the remaining 2 minutes that we have?
Yeah, so would it help other people in the group for more background on any of the Kubernetes concepts or conventions? Like any of the auth concepts like service accounts or role-based access control, or some of the tightly coupled versus loosely coupled stuff I was discussing on the list? Or does everybody get like the claim model, things like that? Because I'd be happy to go over some of that, or get someone from SIG Auth to come and explain some of the authorization mechanisms, or if we need someone from SIG Network to come and explain network policy, any things like that, I could help arrange that.
So speaking just for myself, I personally would love that kind of thing, but I wouldn't want to subject the entire group to that because I have a feeling I'm more new than most people here. So I wouldn't mind like a very, very optional phone call for that kind of information. I wouldn't want to make it an official meeting though, just because I don't want people to feel like they have to show up. But I would love to get that kind of background.
Yeah, I would like that as well.
Yeah, so I think that would be useful. I am wondering to myself whether such a deep dive or shallow dive, so to speak, already exists, but we can certainly schedule something and record it. And as you all know, I've been recording the meetings, so whatever comes out of that is something that we can share with the community.
Okay, and yeah, I guess just one other thing I would point out is a lot of these topics have been discussed in the past before the service broker idea was proposed, and I think many of them will still want to implement independent of the service broker. Mm-hmm. For example, if we come up with a way of automatically injecting secrets into pods, we'll want that to be usable independently of the service catalog and service broker. Or automatically configuring network policy or whatever it is. I think these are common things that batch applications will want, and existing applications that are created by users using the existing Kubernetes mechanisms or existing systems built on top of Kubernetes like OpenShift or Deis workflow or whatever it is. In particular, a bunch of like credential generation is something we've discussed for a long, long time. And I think that would be a useful thing to support independent of this whole mechanism as well. So I'll try to point out those existing issues and discussions where they come up, and we can try to figure out how to make sure that they work really seamlessly for the service broker, but also that it's possible to invoke them independently where appropriate.
Yeah, I'll give a big +1 to that, Brian. I've been trying to call out things that are areas where we can make some advancements in the core that are usable by everybody. But I think that is one of the cross-cutting value adds that we can provide in the SIG is making advancements on those things. And also, I will call out that I am hoping to have automatic secret or config map injection in environment variables proposal out pretty soon, me or somebody from my team. All right, well, we are at time, so I'm going to end the meeting here. Thanks everybody for coming. One last thing. What is the appetite in the group for another meeting, same time tomorrow, to continue hashing this stuff out before next week?
That'd be great.
Okay.
I can do it.
I hear stomachs growling in hunger for another meeting. So another meeting there shall be.
Yeah, so and the mailing list hasn't been used very much. I don't know if people are using Slack. And honestly, due to my meeting schedule and whatnot, I can't pay attention to Slack. So, if people want kind of broader participation, I personally would prefer either the mailing list or GitHub issues. And GitHub has its own challenges getting how many zillions of notifications I get from GitHub. But, in order to make progress between meetings as well, I think.
Yeah. I think that's a good point.
Useful for me. So anyway, I prefer the mailing list just because it's easiest for me to respond asynchronously and to filter out separately from everything else.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe in advance of tomorrow, then we can discuss both the agenda and the specifics of the items on the agenda in advance of tomorrow's meeting, and try to work more asynchronously. All right, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. It is appreciated, and I will see you all on the internet.
Yeah, so just quickly, Doug, if you want to ask on the mailing list questions about the service account and whatnot, I can send you some pointers.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks.
All right. See you, everybody.
Cool, thanks.